Welcome to session 215 of the Bible in a Year commentary. If you started this series on the 1st of January, then today should be the 3rd of August. Today we'll be looking at Zechariah 9 to 14 and Psalm 60. But so far in Zechariah, we've read through the introduction, Zechariah's 9 visions and dreams, and teachings on fastings versus justice. Zechariah is a book collecting together visions of the prophet Zechariah around the same time as Ezra and Nehemiah. It opened with a call to repentance and then described a series of visions that the prophet had had. There was the 1st and 8th vision, each with horsemen patrolling the earth and declaring peace. Then there was the 2nd and 7th visions, both focusing on the exile into Babylon. The 2nd vision had 4 horns representing Babylon scattering Israel, and 4 blacksmiths representing Persia destroying Babylon. The 7th vision had an unclean woman transported to Babylon in a basket. Visions 3 and 6 were focusing on the new kingdom that God was building. The 3rd vision had a man holding a measuring line planning out the new Jerusalem, and the 6th had God purifying his city of wickedness. Finally, the 4th, 5th and 9th visions were all about the leaders of God's new kingdom. Vision 4 had the high priest, Joshua, standing in God's courtroom. Satan tried to accuse him of being unworthy, but God took the filthy clothes that Joshua was wearing and replaced them with clean ones, declaring him worthy. Vision 5 focuses on Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel was one of the descendants of King David and so was part of the royal line. Then in Vision 9, God partnered Zerubbabel and Joshua together, hinting to a future where God's people will be led by a single man who was both priest and king. Then some of the people came to Zechariah to ask if they should continue fasting or if God was ever going to come back. Zechariah challenges their motives, arguing that they only fast out of ritual habit. It no longer carried any real meaning in their hearts. It would be much better if they did the things that God actually asked of them, like pursuing justice, helping the poor, and having mercy. With that said, there is a time coming when God will dwell with his people again, where people will live to old age and the city will be filled with young children. All that is expected of his people is that they pursue justice, truth, and peace, and stop seeking to do evil to one another. Then God will turn their season of mourning into celebration. But let's jump in with today's reading, Zechariah 9 to 14. God pronounces judgment on foreign nations. He starts in the north and marches south to reach Jerusalem. He will attack and destroy them before returning to his temple to watch over it that no one may destroy it again. Then comes an image of the future king. Zechariah sees him entering the city on a donkey. It will be a time of peace, with God doing away with the military might of his people. They won't need it anymore. God will rescue his people from the pit of death, the waterless pit. God will be their protection. He will be like a shepherd to them and make them prosper. The people will once again turn to God and seek his blessing. He is the one that will give them rain for their harvest. No longer will they seek their household gods. God will punish their wicked leaders, who have been like bad shepherds to his people. He will bless and strengthen the people. He will call them back from all the different places that they'd been exiled. He will defeat their enemies so that they can return free. The strength of these other nations will be like whole forests of great trees chopped down. The false shepherds will weep. Then Zechariah is given a vision of what it was like to be a prophet before the exile. He was to be a shepherd to a wicked people who would not listen to him. God would hand them over to be crushed by their enemies. The people continue to resist the prophet, so he breaks his staff of favour, representing God's blessing over his people, and then he breaks his staff of unity, splitting the nations of Israel and Judah apart. Instead, God is going to put a different leader over his people, one that doesn't care about them and seeks only to destroy them. Coming back to his current time, Zechariah gets a vision from God of what he will do in the future. He will use Jerusalem to punish these foreign nations. It will be like a cup of strong wine that causes the foreign nations to stumble around drunk, or a really large stone that they struggle to lift. God will strike down the enemies of his people and then give his people strength to overcome them. He will protect and defend his people. God then mentions one whom they have pierced. Let's have a look at Zechariah 12 verse 10. There will come a person who belongs to God, who will be pierced by the people, and the people will mourn. But on that day, it will be like a fountain that's opened up that will cleanse the people of their sin. In short, there will come a man who is pierced by the people, but his piercing will cleanse the people of their wickedness. And in that time, God will remove the worship of other gods. Those who claim to be prophets but don't speak to God will also be punished. Drawing again on the imagery of a future shepherd, God says that this person will be struck down and their sheep will scatter. Many of those that claim to be God's people will be cut off and perish, but those that remain will be purified by God. They will be his people, and he will be their God. Finally, again, God paints the image of a future day where he will cause the foreign nations to fight against Jerusalem. Many of God's people will suffer, with some leaving the city, but there will be others who remain. Then God will go out and attack and destroy these foreign nations. It will be a dark and terrible day. God will come with his holy people, but then waters of life will spring out of Jerusalem, much like Ezekiel's prophecy of a river of life flowing from the temple. Have a look at Ezekiel 47, verses 1 to 12. God will be king over all the earth. He will strike down the foreign nations with diseases, destroying their wicked. But those that survive will come to Jerusalem to worship God there. There will be peace on the earth, and everything will be holy. There's a lot of confusing imagery in Zechariah. Part of this is because it's a very dense summary of all of the imagery and prophetic words we've had so far. To try and work out what each bit means exactly would likely tie you up in knots. Often these images only make sense after the thing that was spoken about has happened. For now, the key focuses are there will still be suffering for God's people, but there is a future king coming who will also serve as a priest and a shepherd who is going to be struck down and pierced. God is going to destroy all the wickedness and evil in the world, and eventually Jerusalem will be a holy city where people from all nations will come and worship God. But that is the book of Zechariah. Now let's look at Psalm 60. This psalm is attributed to King David, though its explanation is a little bit confusing. It refers to David's victories over other nations found in 2 Samuel 8 verses 1 to 14. But the content of the psalm is focused on lamenting over lost battles. It may be that David and his men faced initial losses against their enemies, that they prayed the prayer of this psalm and then God led them to the ultimate victory. The psalm fits into the category of corporate lament psalm, and as mentioned was sung after a losing battle. Here is a summary of the structure, but I would recommend checking out the written version of this commentary in the description to see the structure properly for yourself. But we start with verses 1 to 5, a complaint to God. Verses 4 to 5, trust that God will make a way. Verses 6 to 9, God responds, and then verses 10 to 12, request and trust. The psalmist starts complaining that God has rejected them. The psalmist assumes that their loss has been brought about by God. God is the one who broke their defences. He's the one who shook the land and tore it open. God forces people to see this difficulty and deal with it. But despite that, the psalmist is also confident that God has made a way for those who still fear him. And so they request that God provides his people with salvation and answers them. God responds. He starts by saying he will divide up Shechem and the Vale of Succoth. These are both places that Jacob/Israel visited as they entered back into the land of Canaan. Have a look at Genesis 33 verse 17 to 19. He then lists places in Israel from north to south. Gilead, Manasseh, Ephraim and Judah all belong to him. In short, God is in control over his land. God then turns to Israel's enemies and discredits them. Moab, Edom and Philistia will all submit to his authority. Who could defeat God and lead him to submit to these nations? The psalm then turns back to the psalmist. They still call out to God. He has still rejected them, refusing to go out with their armies. And so the psalmist leans into their request. Help us defeat our enemies because we can't do it in our own strength. If God was to go with them, they would see victory and defeat their enemies. In this lament psalm, the lesson is clear. Victory is found in God. To go without God will lead to defeat, but to go with God is to be victorious. Thanks for joining us today. Take a moment to reflect on what you've read and share your thoughts or questions below. If you're watching in the future, then you can click here for the next session, or you can find the full playlist just down here. To receive these daily commentaries in your email inbox, subscribe via the link in the description below. Have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow.